Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to the Wilson Center. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. It's a great pleasure to have you here today to talk about an incredibly important issue and a new report from Oxfam Mexico on extreme inequality in Mexico. As we all know, the issue of inequality has been one of the most contentious issues both in academia and in the popular press recently over the past year or so. And of course, we return time and time again to the debate between inequality, poverty, economic growth, rising middle classes, etc. A lot of the work that we've done here at the Mexico Institute over the past couple of years, of course, has focused on Mexico's great potential. The rising middle class that we saw at the end of the first decade of the 2000s. The impact of sustained but low economic growth on the country. But poverty and inequality have been enduring issues, obviously. We're delighted to have with us Ricardo Fuentes Nieva, who is the new executive director of Oxfam Mexico. Welcome and congratulations on your new appointment.
Thank you.
And Jonathan Fox, I won't say an old friend, but a long-time friend and a very good friend to the Mexico Institute. He was, of course, Professor of Development Studies at American University and one of the directors of Oxfam America. What we're going to have here is a presentation from Ricardo, comments from Jonathan, and then I do hope that we have a lively discussion. I know, having read the report, I have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of issues in here that will provoke lively debate, I believe. So hopefully you will have a chance to come up with some issues for conversation in the period that we have after the presentations. Without any further ado, Ricardo, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? My presentation is.
Sorry, give me 1 second. There you go.
So, well, I mean, first of all, thank you everyone for waking up early in a hot summer day, and thank you for the invitation and just the time for organizing this. There are a couple of things I want to say before I start. The first is that I'm still the head of research for Oxfam Great Britain, and I'm transitioning towards my new job as executive director of Oxfam Mexico. So I'm kind of like in between. So I'm going to be wearing two hats: the hat of head of research for OGB, and the hat of the incoming executive director for Oxfam Mexico. And the second one is that I'm presenting a paper written by someone else. It's a paper written by Gerardo Esquivel, a renowned economist in Mexico. And I work with Gerardo very closely, and I'll explain to you how we came about this document and what we're trying to do with it, as well as presenting the results. So bear with me if I don't know all the details, because it's Gerardo the author, but I hope I can make justice to his fantastic work. So this document was presented in the last week of June. It was launched in Mexico City, and ever since it's been in all the Mexican media and some of the international media, and we're very happy with that reception. But I mean, I have to say, we're not surprised, or it was not unexpected, because Oxfam's been working on this topic of extreme inequality for at least a couple of years. And the success that we've had with this kind of work suggested that we could do it at the national, I mean, we've had a lot of success at the global level. It suggested that we could replicate it at the national level, wherever the problem of extreme concentration of income and wealth was important. So before I go into the results of the paper, I want to tell you what we've been doing, why are we doing it, and why Mexico is a case in point. Well, first, so in January 2014, we released a paper during the World Economic Forum at Davos. The paper was called "Working for the Few," and that paper was written by one of my colleagues in Oxfam America. I hope to see him here, but he's not here, and myself. And that paper was titled "Working for the Few." And in Working for the Few, what we did, we looked at different databases, and looked at what was happening with the extreme tail of the concentration of income and wealth, using databases that have been floating around in the academic debate, but had not been used for policy discussion or advocacy discussion. The two databases that created most kind of news was the Global Wealth Database, commissioned by Credit Suisse and collected by and produced by Tony Shorrocks and people, and with that, I mean, it's the first serious attempt to get a distribution of wealth, not income, wealth, across the world. And with that database, we came up with a calculation that the 85 richest people in the world control as much wealth as the bottom half of the population, and that became kind of like a trending topic almost immediately. It set the agenda in Davos in 2014, and it allowed us to explore the topic of relevance. The other database that we were using was the database collected by Tony Atkinson, Emmanuel Saez, and Thomas Piketty, using tax records and looking at the share of income going to the top 1%. And using that database, what we found is that I mean, there are several countries for which we have information between like sometime in the 80s and sometime in the late noughties. And for the 26 countries for which we have information, 24 of those had seen the share of income going to the top 1% increase. So it was something that kind of like, I mean, it was so blatant, it was so big. It was like, I mean, another calculation that we did showed that 70% of people lived in countries where income inequality has increased over the past 30 years. So we wanted to draw attention to that trend, that like using lots of different databases and using different definitions of economic resources, wealth and income that are different, and we recognize that, you know, but like, I mean, using different measures of economic resources, we could see this concentration as a trend that was happening more often than not. And then a lot of people were asking, just like, why is Oxfam working on this? Why is Oxfam working on issues of extreme wealth? You shouldn't be concerned about the rich. You should be concerned about extreme poor. That's your mandate. That's what people should be doing. And in working for the few, what we were trying to do was to say, well, actually, these issues are connected, and one of the ways in which they're connected is through the political process, something that we call political capture. Whenever you have this massive concentration of income and wealth in the hands of very few people, you know, like, I mean, that's the 85 richest people controlling as much wealth as the bottom half of the population, you obviously have a skewed distribution of power and influence. So some scholars in the US have used the phrase affluence and influence, and I think that's appropriate. Yeah, so when we see this skewed distribution of economic resources, what we see is a skewed distribution of influence and political influence. And that's why we were trying to say, well, I mean, and these affects people in poverty, you know, because like, I mean, Oxfam is a rights-based organization. We believe that income poverty should be fought against, but we also believe that poverty is much more than income. That lack of income, you know, poverty is also lack of voice, lack of agency, lack of political representation, and all those things. And when you have this skewed distribution of resources, you obviously will have a skewed distribution of political power. And then we showed those kind of linkages in different case studies. One of the case studies was Mexico, and then being that I'm Mexican, and being that Oxfam Mexico wanted to launch the campaign, we started in conversations, and we decided to actually commission a similar paper, a paper similar to Working for the Few, but in the case for Mexico. And that's how I contacted Gerardo Esquivel, who's, as I said, a renowned economist in Mexico, formerly at the Colegio de Mexico, now at UNAM. And like through several conversations, we came up with the outline of the paper that I'll be presenting today. And the idea is kind of like, I mean, what part of that narrative that that we were exploring at the global level applies to Mexico, and why, and what are the consequences? So it's the first step towards a long series of not only documents but efforts to understand better what's happening with this concentration of income, wealth, and all other resources in Mexico. What are the consequences, and what can we do to tackle that, or to tackle the pernicious effects of this trend? So the one request I have for the audience is to think, how can we expand this agenda in the next months and years? How can we illuminate the problem, and how can we find solutions and push the public debate, the policy debate in Mexico and beyond, as part of this work that Oxfam is doing? So that was a long preamble. I thought it was needed, so I could show that I knew what I could show you that I know what I'm talking about before I go to Gerardo's paper. And then let me tell you the results of the document. So first, we were looking at what was happening again at the extreme end of the distribution, and so Gerardo and other colleagues have done this exercise, trying to replicate, using different methodologies. What's the share of income going to top 1%? And they're using different methodologies, and I apologize because I couldn't really explain the details of the methodology. But using methodologies that are consistent with what Piketty and Atkinson and Saez are doing, they calculated for the first time the share of income going to the richest 1% in Mexico. And the result is, you can see at the bottom of the graph, Mexico is like about 21%. And it's the highest share for any of the countries for which we have information. So the first result is just that. Just like Mexico is the most unequal country for which we have information when we calculate this concentration of income, as a share of income going to top 1%. So this is if you read the document, this will probably come as a surprise, because there's been the narrative that in Latin America inequality has been decreasing over the past 15 years, and there's some truth to that, but that's when you measure measure inequality with the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient usually uses household surveys, and household surveys are notoriously bad for capturing the extreme end of the distribution. So this is a way of correcting that extreme end of the distribution, and then showing what's happening with that top end of the distribution, which is part of the overall kind of new insights coming from the work of the academics that I mentioned, using tax records, because their work allowed us to understand the trends and the processes of concentration of income differently, because we can use different indicators, different data sources, and the like. And that's the first result. The richest 1% in Mexico get 21% of income. So the other part was to look at billionaires, Mexican billionaires, because Mexican billionaires are a notorious bunch. They're very prominent in the media. They have a lot of influence in public policy in Mexico. And then we were trying to see what has happened, with the fortunes of the billionaires. And so we're using these 4 billionaires, and then we're looking at what's happening, to their fortune as a percentage of GDP. And I know we're using stocks and flows But just like, I mean, just the way you measure debt to GDP, you know, like that's also stock on a flow. We think we can compare this just as an illustrative measure because we're looking at the trend. So what we see is that like over the last 10 years, the wealth of the richest 4 Mexicans represent a larger share of GDP. You know, like, I mean, they could, I mean, so basically, if they were to spend all the resources, they could buy a larger share of the Mexican economy in 1 year. And so that's another of the results. And then what we're trying to look is like, I mean, at that massive change in the trend in the early noughties again, you know, that was kind of like, I mean, in a way, fell through the financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008. But then it went back up again after, like, they recovered very quickly.
Ricardo, can you go back to we cannot see from here what the brown, blue, and black line represent. Can you tell
It's
us?
different. So the top one is the four richest billionaires in Mexico, and then they're disaggregated. You know, the second one is Carlos Slim, and the last one is like the other 3: Larrea, Balleres, and Salinas Pliego. And the next one is a similar case. You know, but like, I mean, now we're looking at a different measure, and this came up as when reading a book by Branko Milanovic, who's one of the foremost experts on income inequality in the world. And in his book, 2011 book, Branko does a simple calculation. And he says, he tries to respond, who's the richest man in history? And then obviously it's very complicated to compare fortunes, you know, across time and across space. So he goes back, Branko goes back to Adam Smith, chapter 5 of The Wealth of Nations, and says, you know, like, I mean, the wealth of a man should be measured by the amount of labor he can command. And it's important to mention that it's a he, you know, 'cause, like, I mean, structural inequalities make sure that it couldn't never be a woman, so it's part of the gender inequality here. So Branko does that calculation, and then in Branko's paper, in Branko's book, he comes up with the conclusion that Carlos Slim is the richest man in history, because by the time he did the calculation, he could command the labor of about 440,000 Mexicans. 440,000 Mexicans. You know, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. So by comparison, Gates could command like about 70,000, you know, and Rockefeller at the height could command about 130,000 or something like that. So then using that calculation, we thought like, oh, it'd be interesting to look at what has happened since Branko did that calculation, and then that's what we see. And apologies, you know, if you cannot see, but basically, if Carlos Slim, which is again the red line in the middle, could command about half a million Mexicans 10 years ago. By now, he can command the labor, paying the minimum wage, and with the return on his wealth, is not using his wealth. It's a 5% return on his wealth. With 5% return on his wealth, he could command the labor of 2 million Mexicans. So just the return on his wealth, 2 million Mexicans. He could hire, you know, and like, I mean, in total they could hire, like the four richest Mexicans could hire about 3 million Mexicans, and that's not dissimilar to the number of unemployed people in Mexico. So this is, I mean, the part of the story that we're trying to tell, or that Gerardo was trying to tell in this report, was that, like, I mean, this is in a context of very persistent poverty rates in Mexico. So in a way, what we're saying, like, if I can summarize the main message of the report is, Mexico's, and I think Duncan mentioned it in different words, but like, Mexico's been growing slowly, but it's been growing. But poverty is not changing, but the fortunes of very few people are increasing very rapidly. So what we see is a process of exclusive economic growth. So it's what when we were reading and doing this dissemination of this paper, we call the trickle-up economics. Mexico's growing 1% per capita per year, about for the last 20 years. But as you can see, the poverty rates, the poverty rates, they move up and down. They move up after the financial crisis in 94, 95 in Mexico. And then they fell, but then they went back up. But if you take the moving averages of that trend, it's going to be floating. The most comprehensive one, it's going to be floating around 50%. And 50% of Mexicans don't have enough money to what the Mexican government is build their capacities. This is pobreza de capacidades. Again, what we're trying to say is there's been growth in Mexico, positive, slow, small, but positive. But poverty has not been eradicated or even reduced, while the fortunes of very few people continue to increase. So is this something that we think is right? No. We also see that the minimum wage trends are falling, and this is part of a different narrative. But part of the problem is that minimum wages, which are used as nominal anchors for lots of different things in Mexico, the purchasing power of minimum wages has been declining steadily, and that's not what's happening in other countries in Latin America. There's another paper written for the government of Mexico City, that shows that that's not what's happening in other places. So basically, it's so it's the working poor who are suffering, or who are lagging behind. It's just the economy is stuttering, and but the ultra rich and the richest 1% are plowing ahead. So that's the kind of the analysis. That's the analysis. Another thing, I'm not going to stop too much on this, is the share of capital and labor. The share of labor is declining. The share of capital is increasing. This is something that's happening in a lot of countries around the world. There's a lot of evidence that this is one of the common trends, and we'll be exploring more of that as part of the international work that Oxfam is doing for the next Davos moment, for the next World Economic Forum. But in Mexico, it is no different. And then just so we have time for debate. There's a lot more in the paper, so I recommend you read it. I recommend you criticize it. I recommend you challenge us in what we're doing with it. But the policy recommendations, they're very broad. We need a new welfare state in Mexico because the welfare state is not really working. A progressive tax system and fiscal policy. There's a section on how regressive the tax system is in Mexico. Public spending, better public expenditure. There are some really astonishing figures on how many schools don't have access to clean water. Public schools in Mexico, or they don't have access to basic public services. And then public expenditure in Mexico, should be providing for that. And then the question is, why is not? A labor and wage policy, that challenges and changes that downward trend on the wages and the purchasing power of the Mexican worker. And very importantly, issues of transparency and accountability. And I think this is one of the things that very often gets overlooked in these conversations. And I think is one of the most important elements, especially for an organization like Oxfam. Because so people, in the conversations after the release of the report, there have been a lot of TV programs that have been discussing the report at length. And they say, well, do you, and people are asking, so do you want us to pay more taxes? Because I don't want to pay more taxes if I don't know how it's going to be spent, And it's true. It's in a way. So it's a weak recommendation to say we should tax more. We should improve our tax system if we don't improve the expenditure system. But that's also kind of wishful thinking if we say, well, we should tax more and spend better. And I think the element that very often gets overlooked is the issue of transparency and accountability and active citizenship. You know, how citizens need to actually start participating actively in monitoring how that public expenditure gets disbursed, and how, I mean, what is the role of society to make sure that, like, I mean, they're agents for change, and that the government actually represents their interests and their views, and act as agents of citizens. And I think that's one thing that very often gets overlooked. When I was following the conversations in the aftermath of the release of the report, yeah, a lot of the conversations were centered about taxes. And I think it's important. A better tax system, a more progressive tax system is relevant. But it's true that, like, I mean, without better public expenditure and more accountable public expenditure, it'll be hard to sell that. And I think that's where I mean, that's an area that we haven't really talked sufficiently. I think that's an area where organizations like Oxfam Mexico and the whole confederation of Oxfams could work a lot better to tackle these issues of inequality, and that has a direct link with poverty eradication. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much again. So very much looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Ricardo. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to learn from this new work. It's great to see what a big splash it's made in the Mexican media and social media. And I also personally find it very exciting to be able to honor this product of a partnership between a distinguished scholar and a leading public interest group, since those partnerships are actually remarkably rare, in the spirit of contributing to a more informed policy debate, both in Mexico and globally. And I want to make six points that bounce off the report. The first is that the report puts the finger on huge flaws in the conventional income data. I mean, the idea that you would expect people to self-report their actual income, and that many economists would base in perhaps entire careers on analyzing that data as though it actually reflected the way in which income is distributed. It's kind of mind-boggling. And so the paper proposes I think a more realistic approach to this, and I'm sure there can be a lot of methodological debates about how to get closer to reality. If I understand correctly, this paper essentially takes off from estimates drawn from other Latin American countries that compensate for the underreporting, Chile, Uruguay, and Colombia, and looks at what would the actual income distribution in Mexico look like if it followed the patterns in those countries, which I would argue is actually a very conservative approach, because there's no reason to think that the degree of underreporting in Mexico is actually the same. It could be quite much worse than Uruguay or Chile. So this, as powerful as these sort of killer stats are on income distribution, I would argue that they're actually conservative in their attempt to approach a more reality-based estimate. The second point is that the paper does a great job of broadening the frame that dominates the discussion of tax policy in Mexico, particularly by comparing Mexico to other OECD countries. If I recall correctly, there was a tax reform, a modest tax reform in 2013 that, for example, began taxing mining for the first time. And it's striking that this tax policy debate has focused primarily on, should we extend the value-added tax to food and medicine or not? That's kind of the big way in which the debate is framed. And the paper does a great job of broadening the scope beyond that and putting consumption tax in its place and asking, why aren't capital gains taxed at all? I mean, in the United States, the debate is why are capital gains taxed only at 15% compared to income tax, and that leads to a handful of hedge fund bonuses being, comparable to what all kindergarten teachers are paid. There was some killer stat about that. If couple months ago that I think Hillary had mentioned, and that she was subjected to all of the fact checking, and it turned out it was correct. And so here it's a matter of at what percent are capital gains taxed. In Mexico, there are no taxes on capital gains. There are almost no taxes on property. And if you wonder, why are municipalities in fiscal crisis? Well, maybe not taxing property has something to do with it. No inheritance tax whatsoever. Extremely low vehicle tax. And the paper points out this would be a pretty straightforward way to have a more progressive tax. So you have this long list of giant, I won't even say loopholes, because it's not as though there's a policy to have a loophole in. And then tax deductions. Private school tuition is tax deductible. And that is connected to the fact that public schools, 31% of them lack, I would say, probably piped water. Potable water would be a more optimistic approach. And so you have essentially a systemic undertaxing, and this becomes clearer when you compare Mexico in the broader OECD context. The third point is the paper really lifts up the issue of the minimum wage, and it's great to see that the Wilson Center did this infographic last year on minimum wage. Basically, Mexico's minimum wage is down around Honduras, and sort of the last thing any proud Mexican wants to be compared to is kind of a banana republic. But on the issue of minimum wage, there we are. And this came up in the news recently in this unprecedented for the last 20 years or so, strike of farm workers in San Quintin in Baja California, where in the negotiations around how to respond to the workers' demands, the issue of, how to increase wages came up and was negotiated. And one of the trickiest parts was that the minimum wage turned out to be not a very relevant benchmark at all when it's way below the poverty level, like in the U.S. It's not that many countries where you can work full-time at the minimum wage and be below the poverty level that Mexico shares with the United States. It's been at least a couple decades. It's been true in the United States. And so in Baja, this was a big challenge because most of the workers were paid primarily by piece rate, and the companies could say, well, look, we pay above the minimum wage. If you look at the piece rate equivalent for the most productive workers during the peak of the season. And so this debate is actually continuing. But there were some important wage gains for some of the lagging companies. The companies that already paid the highest rate didn't end up having to pay much. But this was a huge deal, this strike. When was the last time that several thousand workers in Mexico went on strike and actually won anything at all? In this case, the best estimates were about 8,000 of the either 30 or 60,000 farm workers, depending on how you define the scope of the area. And one of the main challenges they face is something that the report alludes to, which are the institutional constraints on workers' right to self-representation. Essentially, during the two sexenios of PAN rule, the political capital was not invested in reforming labor so that unions could become autonomous and democratic organizations. And so the farm workers in Baja, who are primarily domestic migrants from other parts of Mexico, Oaxaca and Guerrero, many of whom have settled there, they were not able to go beyond their wage demands to really win one of their other demands, which is the right to self-representation. Because in that sector, like in so many other economic sectors in Mexico, there are paper unions, ghost unions, so they already are formally represented, but not in practice, which creates huge obstacles. It's harder to get rid of an existing set of supposed representatives on paper than it is to create something new. So they're pretty much stuck in terms of their capacity to have their own voice. The fourth point is that the report points out the powerful ethnic dimension to poverty and inequality in Mexico by focusing on the difference between the indigenous poverty rates and the general population. And this is also a reminder of the counter-argument to, there's a common idea, well, you have to have growth, you have to have inequality, and that's going to reduce poverty, so we can handle some inequality because the growth is going to reduce poverty. Well, we saw that actually didn't happen in Mexico. The trickle-down didn't happen. Their government did put money into social policy, but it was just barely enough to keep things from getting much worse for those who are on the receiving end of economic policy. And so the data on indigenous poverty show 40% of the indigenous population narrowly defined in extreme poverty compared to 10% of the general population. Only 20% of indigenous people are not non-poor. But I would argue that this really underestimates the polarization between indigenous and non-indigenous poverty, because the comparison is in the papers between indigenous poverty and the general population, but the general population includes all the indigenous poor people. So you'd see even a more dramatic difference if you compared indigenous to non-indigenous. And then fifth, second to last point on the political capture. I'm sure there'll be many comments on political capture. The main evidence in the paper for this is looking at those 4 top billionaires and noting that they're all in the growth of their fortunes were in sectors that were basically rent-seeking. The massive giveaways of giving away Mexico's mineral resources, and the telecoms and government-regulated broadcast media. And so I think many of you will have something to say about the nature of political capture and what would it take to undo that. And that brings me to the final point on transparency and accountability. And the report concludes by saying this is crucial for addressing political capture, and begins with one, I would argue, very modest suggestion, which is to have mandatory asset disclosure for public officials and elected officials. And this is, based on the assumption that sunshine is the best disinfectant. Though in the Mexican context, we already saw that asset disclosure, not officially, but by the independent media, actually doesn't necessarily lead to accountability. We saw in the case of the president, his wife's assets, that this can be revealed, and the conflict of interest with private contractors can be revealed to essentially no effect. And this raises a broader question about the transparency and accountability agenda in Mexico, which is that Mexico has one of the most impressive and well-functioning sort of access to information machines in the world. And expensive, and so it's amazing the kind of information access rights citizens have that recently expanded to include subnational governments, which is going to be a big deal potentially, because that's many citizens' main interface with their governments. But we see a huge gap between the progress on the right to information front and the lack of progress on the accountability front. We see institution after institution that is responsible for pursuing accountability really not succeeding at their job, whether it's the Secretaría de Función Pública, whether it's the electoral court that is supposed to fine political parties for breaking campaign rules, as we saw with the Green Party, whether it's the Supreme Audit Institution that can flag and identify corruption time and again, and each time we see let's just say a limited follow-up, very few consequences in response to revelations of conflicts of interest. So looking forward, Mexico is going to be the host for a global summit of the Open Government Partnership, an international initiative that the Mexican government and civil society organizations have invested heavily in. That'll be in late October. Past global summits of the Open Government Partnership have been occasions for the host governments to announce major breakthroughs where long pending transparency reforms were given that final push. It was the hosting the summit made for a tipping point in Brazil at the first global summit of the OGP. It was the occasion where the government finally pushed through Brazil's freedom of information law. In London, when the British government hosted the Open Government Summit a year and a half ago, they announced a huge breakthrough mandating public disclosure of beneficiary ownership, which is a crucial reform for addressing the trillions of dollars of dark money that circulate around the world, and making possible eventually some kind of potential financial transaction tax and so forth. So these occasions have been moments that help to tip the balance in other countries in internal governmental policy debates in favor of reformers. And so one of the big questions looking forward to October is whether or not this Mexico's hosting of the summit will be an occasion for a positive step forward in terms of the kind of transparency that is actually linked to accountability, or whether it will serve as a yet another wonderful ceremonial, sort of ritualistic conference that doesn't actually go anywhere. And I look forward to learning more about Oxfam's potential contribution to this agenda looking forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think this is what we see here is a paper which brings us into a debate over the issues that both of you have laid out, but it does so from the perspective of inequality. And there are so many different ways into the same debate. I mean, I can't remember, I don't know how many times we've sat here at this table and we've discussed a lot of these issues, whether it was through the lens of economic growth, whether it was through the lens of justice, and social justice in particular, whether it's through the lens of democracy, and that clearly comes out both in the paper and in the conversation here, and of course the conversation over poverty. And so I have to say I have a number of doubts about whether inequality is the best way to get into this, and I'd like to have that conversation here. But it certainly casts a different lens on these same issues. I have a number of points here, but first of all, let me just thank Barbara Durr, who has become a firm friend in my time here in Washington, one of the first people that I met here in DC, and I'll never forget that I did actually stand you up at our first appointment. You know, those crazy moments when you move to a new city and your agenda is going crazy, and I double booked. I was actually doing an interview at the time, and I get this text message from Barbara saying, "Are you coming?" I was like, "Oh, no, Lord." And you forgave me, and I will never forget that. Thank you so much. Let me also say that it's clear that, Ricardo, you spent too much time in Britain because you're using the term the noughties, which was a uniquely British thing, I think, about the first decade of the 21st century. And it implies a lot of things in Britain that doesn't necessarily apply here in the United States. But well done on that. I guess I'd like to talk about a number of issues here. The first of all is a chart which appears, and sorry about the small scale here. I know it's completely useless to you, but it's very pretty. So this is the evolution of inequality in Mexico. The red line, so it's essentially the Gini coefficient. The red line is the OECD figures, and the green line is the CEDLAS World Bank figures, okay? What I find intriguing about this is that you see rising inequality throughout the 1980s in Mexico. And I assume that's the result of the Latin American debt crisis, or the Mexican debt crisis in particular. But also it's the end of a particular economic model that was resulting in a concentration of wealth anyway. The key point for me here occurs around 1995, where you reach that peak of inequality, and then you see a very rapid decline in inequality, ending in 2010, where I assume we're seeing the impact of the 2009 economic financial crisis on Mexico. One of the questions that I have here is, what's the connection here between sort of the opening of the Mexican economy, the NAFTA, okay, in 1994, low economic growth rates, sort of around the 2% of GDP per year since then, macroeconomic stability, which is one of the great achievements of Mexico in the past 2 decades, is that they have avoided essentially financial crises, excessive government spending, deficit spending, etc., and that declining rate of inequality. And I know that you say that that's just one measure of inequality, and this paper focuses more on the extreme wealth there. But I find this a very interesting correlation here. Not necessarily causality, but there is a correlation here. And it's shown by both sets of figures. So economic openness, macroeconomic stability seems to have been very, very good for inequality in Mexico. At the same time, of course, you've seen the success of programs like Oportunidades Prospera, which are both mentioned in this paper as well. And I think that's one of the issues that we should bring out here as well, is that Mexico has achieved a great deal through programs like that, regardless of, well, not regardless, but of course we have to take into consideration the problems of transparency and accountability in those programs. Now, that's one of the issues I'd like to put onto the table. The other one is, how much is this report and other reports that Oxfam has done about shaming and sort of forcing the debate, which I find very, very interesting. You know, shaming has been a very powerful factor in forcing wealthy elites to actually change their behavior. And perhaps one of the best examples of that is Carlos Slim himself, who for years resisted philanthropic works, and then eventually it was his peers who forced him or persuaded him to actually begin donating more of his money to philanthropic efforts. I'd be very interested in looking at, I mean, a lot of the figures here end in 2012, but of course we have the 2013 fiscal reform and the decision not to apply the IVA to food and medicine, not because it was an issue of social justice, because it was a political calculation. I think we can say that. But what impact is that having? I mean, we've seen that the tax rate, government income has begun to rise because of the effect of that fiscal reform. And of course, you can put that alongside the expansion of oportunidades into Prospera. You know, is there some kind of link there? We're also seeing the at least the beginnings of a universal healthcare system in Mexico, which presumably will have a very positive impact upon poverty rates, not on inequality, but on poverty rates. And then I'd also like to, I mean, transparency and accountability, words that have come out a number of times here at the table. I'd like to recognize that Marco Fernandez is our summer scholar here at the Mexico Institute, who has a long history of working in these issues, both at the Tec de Monterrey and in Mexico Evalúa. And so I'd be interested in hearing from you, Marco, about how you believe that these transparency, accountability issues play into the conversation over inequality and poverty. And just lastly, because I've said that, is it really about inequality or is it really about poverty? I mean, my own personal feeling, and talking to people in Mexico throughout all the time that I lived there, was that if people believe that their standard of living is getting better, or rather, probably the better measure is, if they believe that the standard of living of their children is going to be better than theirs, then they actually believe that there is progress and that they're less likely to complain. It's less about the extreme inequality. In fact, I've spoken to a number of Mexicans who actually say, hey, you know what? We have the world's wealthiest man, or we have the world's second wealthiest man. We've got to be doing something right, which is a bizarre point of view when you're, when you're in that situation.
He's getting a badger. He's the fourth.
There you go. As a result of this report, I'm sure. No, and I'd be interested in saying, is it poverty that's really the issue, or is it inequality? And I still haven't got my head around the whole Piketty debate. I have to say I don't know where I stand on it. And with that, I'd like to sort of open it up for another couple of comments from the questions from the audience. I've got Eric and Marco.
This might be sort of what you were getting at the end, but not having read the paper, it sounds like it's a description of It sounds like it's a description of something, but it doesn't explain why it's important, or it's not clear to me. And I feel it's important, but I don't know from your perspective at Oxfam, is it important because it's a moral issue? Is it important because of its impact on politics? Or is it important because it's bad for development and bad for economics? And what's the case you're making with regard to that? Because, it just wasn't clear in what you presented. And again, I'm sympathetic. I don't want this to sound hostile, but it wasn't clear to me what case you were trying to make.
Thank you, Eric. Marco. Marco, perhaps you could introduce yourself better than I did.
Hi, I'm Marco Fernandez. I'm a fellow for the summer here at the Mexico Institute. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Government in Tec de Monterrey and a researcher in Mexico Evalúa. I'm working both in topics related to anti-corruption, particularly because of the reform that is going on in Mexico, and transparency and education reform. Said that, I really like the paper, particularly because it portrays one of the main problems in Mexico, that is the inequality. However, what I miss from the paper is the political economy perspective. And it is very noticeable, this lack of perspective, particularly when you go to the policy recommendations that come at the end of the paper. And because I'm a political scientist, I mean, I wasn't, I mean, unavoidably thought, okay, what about the problem of clientelism that is precisely related to inequality and how political parties take advantage of those inequalities and poverty rates and look for political dividends. Then there is this huge literature in political science about preferences for redistribution. Because, I mean, there are these recommendations that, yes, we need a better welfare state, etc. But, I mean, who is in favor of that in the different segments of the population? And I think that that is something that in future reports, Oxfam really has to take seriously in order to create, for example, this shared, at least of a part of the population, shared feeling of fairness that is related to one of the points that you underscore in the report, that is the lack of accountability and the problem of corruption. And precisely because taxpayers say, why am I going to pay more, the captive taxpayers, if there is first an important segment of the population that is not paying taxes, and once and again, I'm seeing that my resources are misspent because of these scandals of corruption. I mean, Jonathan Fox has written a lot on the issue of transparency, and I like one of his phrases in one of his papers. Transparency works under the assumption of shame. But the problem is that when you have shameless, as it seems that we are having in Mexico, then the accountability consequence of the transparency doesn't come into play. And therefore, this undermines the possibility to reduce inequality. The final point that I want to point out to the paper is that, for example, in the case of education, I mean, the paper talks about the importance of improving education and contrast between the possibility of tax exemptions for private tuitions with a lack of resources or services in public schools. But we know that Mexico is not spending little on education. It's misspending. And this is when political economy perspective is essential. We know that there is a teachers union that has captured the system, that has gained from corruption and misuse of these public funds, that the Auditor General has exhibited the misuse of many of these funds for commissioned for the teachers union. Nobody has been processed because of that, and it seems that it's an endless waste of resources to a sector that is resisting the change. Right now we're observing that with education reform. Or, for example, to put it in, and this is where preferences comes into play, every time that in some public universities there has been an attempt to change the fees that are charged for people of the middle class, because let's face it, middle class is the people that go to college, and it's not popular to say it in Mexico because you immediately are disqualified as a neoliberal. But every time that someone tries to increase fees, for example, at UNAM, there are massive protests. Nothing is changed. The presidents of the university basically have to quit their jobs. So in that sense, this portrays you the difficulty to change policies that are associated to inequality. And therefore, for future reports, it is really essential that Oxfam takes seriously political economy perspective.
Thank you, Marco. And we've got we'll take another question here from Chris. Yeah. Actually, while the microphone is getting to you, Chris, let me just mention one thing. At a World Economic Forum meeting in New York in November of last year, a top banker, I forget the guy's name, came onto stage and he said the reason why inequality matters is not actually inequality itself, but it's the perception of inequality. And he made the point, he says, when you see the major changes throughout history, it's been when the perception of inequality has actually risen, rather than actually inequality rates. And so inequality, if people are sort of unconcerned about it, or if they don't even notice it, or if the information isn't there, it becomes much less important than when actually people begin to think about it. And I wonder if that feeds into, again, the sort of the question about shaming, transparency, et cetera. Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much. Chris Wilson, Deputy Director of the Mexico Institute. I have one very quick and simple, well, perhaps not simple question to answer, but simple to ask. Around 2003 is about when I think I saw on the graph the level of wealth of the top billionaires really began to take off. What happened? What caused that? Because I guess the question behind the question is, if what we're seeing there is really the problem, then what caused it, and what are the policy implications of that? Because that would be sort of the place to get the policy implications of this special branch of inequality, which is extreme wealth. And then just a quick comment. I mean, I really applaud your conclusion and your final remarks on the key role of looking at transparency, anti-corruption, accountability, that whole basket of issues as one of the real clear conclusions of this type of work. And I think that you're arriving in Mexico to lead Oxfam at just the moment to dive headfirst into that issue. I mean, this is an issue that is happening, right? The debate is everywhere in Mexico. People like Marco and other, new, strong civil society in Mexico City have placed this firmly on the national agenda and achieved some success in having passed an anti-corruption law that now needs to be implemented, and having the weight of sort of the whole anti-poverty, development, anti-inequality movement and political constituency squarely behind these initiatives to advance the agenda on transparency and accountability will be fundamental for the future of Mexico, in my opinion. So.
No, I do agree.
Yes,
I do agree, and that's one of the reasons why I'm going back. If I hadn't had that perception or that analysis, I wouldn't have accepted the job. But anyway, so I'll try to be fair to all the questions and give enough time, and probably Jonathan will have something to say too. And let me frame it on the poverty and inequality and why we're working on this. Is this a moral issue or not? And then try to link it, all together. And I think it's a question that keeps coming back. It keeps coming back, and we keep kind of convincing people, little by little. So I hope, I'll convince you a little bit at the end of this. We've done a lot of work on this. Over the past couple of years, a lot more people kind of think that there's actually a relationship between inequality and poverty. And I'm not saying it's because of the work we're doing, but it's because the evidence is becoming clearer, and it's an evidence that links. So the argument 15 years ago, 20 years ago, was that the wealth creation was what matters, and it's a positive sum, if we create wealth, if we have a system that creates wealth, it really doesn't matter who gets the bigger share as long as everyone's improving, lifting all boats, and then it's a positive sum, there's no, if the rich are getting richer, who cares if the poor are getting 10 cents more a day? And that was the narrative. Yeah, if you were to contest that narrative, that was called the politics of envy. And it was very strong. People at the World Bank wrote lots of papers on why that was wrong, and why we should focus on the absolute gain of income of the poorest. I think what we've learned, and that relates to Marco's point on political economy, is that a lot of these development processes are actually zero-sum games, and that relates to distribution of power, economic power, political power, and something that we are kind of exploring more and more, the cultural and narrative power. Mm-hmm. So why do we work on this? Do we work on this because it's a moral issue? No. Do I think it's a moral issue? I do think it's a moral issue, but that's my personal preferences, but that's not why we're working on this. We're working on this because, it's all the literature on political economy exactly that shows that this really skewed distribution of resources, this really skewed concentration of income and wealth actually distorts the political process, that political process, inclusive political processes that are pro-poor, So there's an opportunity cost for poverty there. Like, I mean, if you have exclusionary policies, if you have policies that benefit the taxes for the rich, as Jonathan was saying, if there are policies that benefit the preferences of the upper tail of the distribution, like, I mean, those preferences for redistribution that Marco was mentioning, there's an opportunity cost for poverty reduction. There's an opportunity cost for people. If you think of this as the ability of people to influence the decisions of policymakers, the more skewed the distribution of resources, the less opportunity poor people will have to actually do that. And Jonathan mentioned the inability of workers to actually influence labor laws, and there's a lot of kind of like there's a lot of suggestions that's happening all around the world. Is the bargaining power between capital and labor, and the bargaining power within labor of executive pay and other workers that's driving. I mean, it's not only technology and globalization, but it's these changes in bargaining power that's driving that concentration of on capital shares, and within the labor share, the concentration on executive pay. So the issue of power is really important, and the issue of power, it relates completely to the political economy. So I recognize this paper doesn't have the political economy angle, but it's something we think a lot about, and probably we haven't done justice, but we will, and hopefully we'll be able to work it out together. And it's that issue of political power, the main reason why we're working on this. And that issue of political power is why, how this issue of inequality connects to poverty. It's a complicated link. The evidence is mostly case studies. It's very hard to find an econometric analysis that proves this point. But there's a lot of evidence of that's happening, and it doesn't only happen through the political system. It happens through the economic system. The economic capture. So one of the points in the paper, and someone else mentioned it too, is how economic rents are driving these fortunes. And rents are inefficient by definition. So rents are not wealth creating. And then what we see more and more is that a lot of these massive concentration of income and wealth are associated to economic rents, and that also has an impact on poverty, because why is it that rent seekers, or how is it that rent seekers change the systems to protect their privileges, as opposed to actually kind of making a more competitive, more inclusive, more open kind of economic system. So I know it's a convoluted story, and I know the evidence of it is kind of scattered, but that's one of the beauties of working for an organization like Oxfam. I think the burden of the proof should be on the rent seekers, or what we're calling the rent seekers, to say no, it's not true, because we care about poverty, and we care about poor people, and then what we're saying is so poverty is not falling, we all agree on that, poverty is not falling. So what are the reasons? And what we're saying, all the things that have been tried in the past have not really worked in terms of poverty reduction in Mexico, at least. So the inequality agenda, or the inequality angle, provides a new a new possible explanation, which is this explanation of political economy. Even though, I recognize that we might not have given enough attention to this, but it's not. This paper is the first one of many. And in the global work that we're doing, so we have the political capture story. We're going to come up with a more thorough analysis of economic capture and this issue of economic rents. And eventually we'll also look at this kind of cultural narrative capture that you know, the issue of preferences. You know, like, I mean, because I mean, one of the big how can I say one of the big paradoxes is how many people are actually voting against their interest in terms of redistribution. And part of that is because the narrative is so strong, you know, the narrative of the, you know, like a self-made person that can work his way out of poverty. And like, I mean, I've heard the chief economist of the World Bank say, just like, I mean, whoever tells that to a boy in the slums of Mumbai is telling that kid a lie, you know, and that's the other element. Just like, I mean, that idea that we can have equality of opportunity with these levels of concentration of income is just a lie.
Excellent. Jonathan, take some more. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a concentration of 3 questions over here.
Hello, this is Pablo Solorio from the U.S. Department of Labor. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I haven't read the paper, but I'm excited to read it on the Metro ride every morning, so we'll see how it goes. My only question, so I don't know if you talk about this in the paper, what's the role of remittances when it comes to inequality in Mexico? We know it's a major source of funding for impoverished communities, so how does that play in this issue?
Hi, so I'm Ana de la O. I'm an assistant professor at Yale University. And so this is a fantastic paper, and I'm afraid I have a boring question about measurement. So I think that this paper makes 2 very interesting and bold moves. So one focusing on the top of the income distribution, and second focusing on tax returns to measure that wealth. And my sense is that if we were talking about Western Europe, Sweden, that would be the end of the story. But I'm just wondering here in the context of Mexico in particular, Latin America in more general, where the size of the informal economy is so great and tax evasion is so great. I'm just wondering whether this way of measurement opens up other sources of error and bias. And so exactly how would it look like the whole distribution of income if we were to measure it through this new way? So I was missing from the text some discussion about these other sources of measurement error.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nico Luciani from the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and I direct our program on human rights and economic and tax policy. We do a lot of work monitoring fiscal policy from a human rights perspective, and then trying to use human rights and legal accountability mechanisms to hold the fiscal policy cycle more accountable to people. My question was really about, it was mentioned before, tax evasion and avoidance, the questions of assets held offshore, which in many countries provides an escape valve for more progressive fiscal policy. So I didn't really see it in the paper. I was a bit surprised. I'm wondering if that was intentional, or if it was just a question of lack of data, which is always a big gap. Thanks.
Thank you. Ricardo, some specific questions on methodology. I know you said earlier on that you didn't feel particularly prepared for the methodology questions, but
But I mean, I'm based on the conversations and the readings, the conversation I had with Gerardo and the readings I gave is like, and Jonathan mentioned it. So this might actually be an underestimate, you know, for those biases that you're suggesting. So it's not perfect. But like, I mean, I think a lot of those things kind of like, I mean, exist in different other sources. But it's important to put it out there. I know that the World Bank is so some people in the World Bank are using central bank information to do this calculation instead of tax records. So using central bank information on mortgages. You know, on sizes of mortgages, because, like, I mean, as you're saying, the tax records are often unreliable in this kind of emerging market context. So they're doing that for Indonesia. So yeah, a point taken. You know, like, I mean, it's we didn't want to fill the report with methodological data. I mean, it's always a balance. This kind of reports. I mean, you want to present the evidence, be thorough and be rigorous with it, but you don't want to bore the reader with 10,000 footnotes. But the point taken on that one. On tax evasion, the other thing is so the paper. I mean, when you read the report, you see it touches upon a lot of things, and it doesn't go into depth, and that's kind of a tactical decision. We couldn't do justice to all the topics in such a short period of time. I mean, Gerardo started writing this in January, and we published it in June. So it was a very short turnaround. But the idea is to actually use this as a platform, and then have the conversations that we're starting to have right now, and say what are the things that could inform the policy debate and could actually lead to change. Because we don't want to only inform the policy debate. We want to actually achieve some change, through this, through these discussions. So that's partially the response. Was there another one? Remittances, which relates to Chris's question, so part of what was, your question, Duncan, part of what explained the fall in of the Gini coefficient in the 90s was remittances, and then the remittances, immigration in Mexico kind of fell from Mexico to the U.S. fell, so that's partly why that's increasing. The other bit was. And that was kind of a Latin American trend, was the decreasing in wage differentials. Mm-hmm. So remittances have played a role on this, but the other point to make on the Gini is even though remittances and the wage gap closed down, the level was still enormous. It went from 52 to 48, so which is still a very, very high level, So it seems like a big drop, but actually, when you still compare it, is a very high level of inequality.
Jonathan, anything to add here?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think in terms of the role of research in this kinds of debates and the call for more of a political economy analysis, I think there's a big difference between research that is intended to raise awareness by reframing a problem, by putting a problem on the agenda-setting research, in contrast to research that is intended to help to, with political economy analysis, identify the specific coalitions that would be in favor of or opposed to specific reforms that could address the problem once awareness has been raised and the agenda has been reframed. So this is clearly an agenda-setting research effort in contrast that begins to point towards where you would need to go in more detail to actually address the causes of the problem identified, but it's mainly about defining the problem and putting that problem on the public agenda. And I think that one of the things the paper does is I think it does a good job of addressing one of Duncan's concerns, which is that there's some kinds of inequality that are associated with growth, patterns of growth that do raise most votes. Mm-hmm. And there are other kinds of inequality that do not. And the point of emphasizing the rent-seeking dimension and the point of emphasizing those tax policies that actively produce inequality is to say that we're not talking about an inequality that's the result of a kind of, Apple-like innovation and success in the pure sort of entrepreneurial productivity sense. We're talking about other kinds of sources of inequality that do not have the ripple effects throughout the rest of the economy that certain textbooks would lead us to expect. And so I would suggest for one sort of a future candidate for political economy analysis to help shed light on where the opportunities for change would be to do an analysis of the 2013 tax reform that Duncan mentioned, to figure out who were the winners and losers and why. What was it about the legislative politics? What was it about the interest group politics that led to that specific outcome? And what are the lessons that experience tells us for future reform strategy?
Thank you. One final point from me here would be to say that the rent-seeking perspective is crucial. And that's where the open government approach is very, very important. But also, you know, the other rent seekers that Marco mentioned, for example, unions, etc. And you know, it kind of brings us back to that debate that we saw in 2012 about the poderes fácticos in Mexico. Is it the vested interests as opposed to sort of the four wealthiest men in the country that we should be concerned about? Is it less about wealthy individuals and more about politically powerful individuals and organizations or agents within the country that are skewing things and holding back both poverty alleviation and economic growth? And I think that from my point of view, that's a more balanced perspective rather than casting the spotlight on four wealthy individuals. And I understand why that's important. I mean, it captures the imagination very, very well. But I think you provide a more balanced perspective by doing that. I did see a hand go up somewhere at the back here. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, maybe I can also speak to this with Ricardo. I work in research with Ricardo, but here in Washington, D.C., and would
Sorry,
say...
could you give your name?
Kimberly Pfeiffer, yeah. And we are doing, the next step of this work is to do a series of case studies. So we have this in the works now, so maybe perhaps stay tuned. Our first one is in Peru, and it is taking a very similar approach to what Johnny suggested in looking at a few policy reforms and asking those very questions. What happened here? Who are the winners and losers? How does this play out?
May I respond to your point, Duncan?
Please.
No, I think you're right. You know, like, I mean, that it's not only the four rich people who in Mexico who are extracting rents from the economic sector, but also the rich people who are extracting rents from unions, but they're also very rich. You know, so the question and I mean, you're mentioning, well, I mean, that's the politically powerful people, but power is a very kind of easy to hide element, you know. And there's this there's old Mexican saying, one of the most notorious pre-politicians, that un político pobre es un pobre político. And so I think in many ways, you know, like if you change the word politico for powerful, you know, like it'll be hard to think of like a really powerful person who's not also extremely rich in terms of like the rent seeking. The question is why look at income and wealth? Well, because it's something you can observe. Kind of easy. It's more easily observable than power. Mm-hmm. You know, if your concern is political power, you know, how do you measure that? How do you observe that? But we can observe these fortunes, and we can observe how they're changing. And we then, by looking at those fortunes, and the fortunes of not only that, but the union leaders and El Baster Gordillo and the likes, we can track back on their undue influence on not only political processes, but economic processes and usually like all kinds of damaging things for society. So there is a practical reason why we're focusing on this, because we can observe it, and we cannot observe the political power, you know, as you're saying it, you know, like, I mean, so not, I mean, it's true, you know, like not all billionaires are created equal, you know, so, but I mean, at least we have to ask in the context of a Mexican economy and Mexican political system, if you see these kind of things, like, I mean, what is the power behind, you know? And I think we as an organization and Mexican society has to ask we have to ask those questions, because that's part of the reason why we're there.
Absolutely. And yeah, let me just repeat what Chris said. I mean, it's crucial that you're going to be arriving back in Mexico at this time, and it's going to be a very important contribution to the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our time here. Thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in thanking our panelists.